begin this brief lecture by saying to you that this chapter truly is a review chapter or a refresher chapter on information that you should have covered in your Introduction to Social Work course. So I'm not going to take too much time in going over a lot of the information, but I am going to begin to share my screen with you because there are some very specific elements in this chapter that I want to go over with you. All right, and where I want to begin actually in this chapter is starting in your textbook under the topic of historical development in the profession of social work. And right here is where we begin to see these three political perspectives or three political ideologies, how they are spelled out and how they play into the historical perspective and the development of social work as a profession. So the very first one that you see here on the screen is the conservative ideology. Now, just as we reviewed in chapters 1 and chapters 2, when we talk about that conservative ideology, their whole perspective is that each individual person or family is responsible for the condition that they may be in and also responsible for resolving their own problems. The conservative perspective is they look at any type of struggle as being private rather than public. So there is not a lot of buy-in for government assistance, for public assistance for folks coming from the conservative perspective. When we move on, we talk about the liberal perspective and the radical perspective. Here's where we start to see a little bit of a change in the thought process. For the liberal perspective, they're looking at both the responsibility lying with the individual as well as within an institution. So you see here on this second bullet where it talks about the partnership of private and public services. This is where liberals begin to look at how can we make this not just a personal responsibility for the person and or for the individual, and or family that may be going through an issue, but how can we engage public and private sectors within our communities to kind of have buy-in into assisting, not so much pulling folks out of any situation in and of themselves without their participation, but how can we partner with them? How can we extend things beyond this being just the individual's problem, but look at it and go a little bit further than the individual, but also consider institutional problems. The radical perspective, as you see down here, again, we begin to look at how are we going to look at making meaningful change in the lives and in the situations of our clients, consumers, professionals. Clients, consumers, and patients. When we're looking at how we begin to create services, projects, and programs to address any type of need that people may have when they're coming to us as a social work profession. Now, I'm going to go on a little bit. Actually, let me back up a little bit. And again, this is just a review of what you probably already had in Intro to Social Work. We talk about some of the key players that sit at the table in developing the social work profession. We have Dorothea Dix. Again, we're coming down, we talk about our charity organization societies. Let's not forget about the settlement house movements. We had two very key people in our settlement house movements. We had Jane Addams and Ellen Starr. They were very instrumental in that the settlement house movement and had the Hall House settlement in Chicago, where they worked specifically and directly with immigrants in the city of Chicago. So again, this is just a refresher of information that you may have had, or that you should have had, I should say, in the Introduction to Social Work. When we get down a little bit more into the meat in chapter 3, and we begin to look at how the social work profession begins to grow, we see here that we begin to have the development of a national professional organization, and that would be the organization that still is the guiding force for the social work profession, and that would be the National Association for Social Workers. I would strongly encourage each and every one of you, if you have not looked into student membership in the NASW, now would be an awesome time for you to go ahead and do that. Being a member of the NASW affords you a lot of opportunities for not only educationally, but professionally. Educationally, it affords you an opportunity to have access to a lot of academic and scholarly journal articles. And professionally, it begins to give you that opportunity to network with other social work professionals. So again, in this chapter 3, we talk about the continued growth of the professionalism of social work. Not only do we see the establishment of NASW, but we also see a very key component in the education or academics of the field of social work, and that is the creation of the CSWE, the Council on Social Work Education. This is a very instrumental organization that establishes the standards that all social work programs must follow in order to meet accrediting standards. So again, these two very key instrumental professions these two key organizations are very instrumental in the continuation and the growth of the social work profession. Now, when I get down a little bit further in talking about social work as a profession, I want to look at the philosophical base and talk with you a little bit about that. The philosophical base of the social worker profession. This is in your books, beginning on page 83, where we're introduced to just the idea that there may be something that we have to consider. How are we, the social worker, how are we kind of guiding ourselves? How are we measuring ourselves and making sure that we are reaching a very specific level in the standard of care that we offer to our clients, consumers, and patients? And you see here this, the first bulleted item is a very prominent person within the field of the philosophical base of social work, and that's Frederick Reamer. Frederick Reamer, and this is in your textbook on page 84, he began to write specifically about how do we assess ourselves as far as the work that we do as social workers, but then also how are we making sure that we follow through and provide the resources and the services for our clients, consumers, patients as we're going along within this profession. And so some of the things that we get into this first bullet item, the common good, public interest, but this main one, the third one, empowerment. How are we working that, we as social workers, working to build a base within our clients, consumers, patients, that they begin to develop this idea, that they begin to adopt the mindset and the philosophy of empowerment. Empowerment, again, that they would move from a situation that they may be in to a better outcome for themselves. We would see this kind of played out with individuals, families, groups, and organizations. So again, we're talking about the values and the philosophical base within the social work profession. When we're discussing that, just as was addressed in a little bit in chapters 1 and 2, the ethical perspective and dilemmas that we face as social workers, just in working within this field and having that one-on-one interpersonal communication with colleagues, co-workers, clients, consumers, and patients. So one of the first things that we have to look at is this whole idea of self-determination. Self-determination, when we're talking about that, we're looking at that not so much from the worker's perspective, but from your client, consumer, patient's perspective. What is in it for me, if I were the client, to do what it is you, the social worker, are asking me to do? How are you, the social worker, going to encourage me, empower me, that I feel like, or that I begin to gain this idea of self-determination to begin to work towards my goals? The second one that we look at right here, confidentiality. We all know about confidentiality, people. When we're talking about an ethical dilemma in confidentiality, sometimes you may be faced with an ethical violation that you saw committed by a colleague or coworker. You may be faced with having confidential information from a patient, client, customer, consumer, with them saying to you that they have a desire to hurt themselves or someone else. When we're talking about confidentiality, we have to be mindful that there's a very specific line that we have to follow when we're looking at maintaining the confidence of our colleagues, coworkers, as well as our consumers, patients, clients. When it gets down to the point where it is a threat or harm to someone else or to themselves, we know that we also face that other issue of a duty to warn. So we got to be mindful of that as well, people. When we talk about whistleblowing, we're looking at this whole idea of you knowing something, you as the social worker, and how are you going to be dealing with that? How are you going to address the issue, an ethical issue, maybe with a colleague or a coworker, and not fear repercussions because you were bound by and were acting on the values and the standards as laid out by the NASW. One of the other things that we always come upon as social workers is this fourth bullet, dual relationships. Now I need to ask y'all to think about this for a while. How do you handle the idea of a dual relationship? And when I talk about a dual relationship, let's talk about it first from a personal perspective. Let's say that you have a best friend and you have another best friend, but those two people really don't care for each other. How do you handle being in that type of relationship? Or how do you handle moving from being in the role of, we'll say, spouse or significant other to becoming an ex, but still working in the same facility? When we're talking about a dual relationship, we're looking at it from a professional perspective of you, the social worker, having a relationship with a colleague, coworker, client, consumer, patient outside of what you normally do on a regular workday. So for example, for myself as an instructor in the field of social work, there are seldom occasions, or I should say often there are occasions when through social media, I may receive a request, a friend request from a current student or a former student. And I charge all of my students, as well as my colleagues and coworkers, to answer this question for themselves. What do you know of that we have in common outside of the four walls of where we are right now? Whether that be at work, at school, in a shopping environment, what do you know that we have in common? If you can answer that question and answer it confidently, then I can understand why you would send me a friend request. If you're just sending a friend request because, hey, they're a nice person and I just really want to be a part of their social media life, don't do it, good people. Put a pause on it and just really think about, what am I going to benefit from this relationship? So dual relationships, something we really, really, really got to work on and really have to think about. This very last bullet down here, when we talk about social work methods and the way things have changed over the years within the social work profession, when we're talking about how we determine the direction that we may want to go in, we meaning the students in the field of social work, what direction we want to go in. In your text on page 90, this is where the book begins to introduce us to this whole idea of two very specific categories that currently schools of social work kind of follow when they're looking at students determining the direction they want to go in. One direction is with direct practice. The other one would be with planning and organizing. So an administrative track. So direct practice, meaning that you are going to have that one-on-one interaction with your clients, consumers, or patients. The planning or administrative track means that you're going to be more so working in a supervisory position. But what does that really mean? Again, I want you to go back to some of the things you may have learned in Intro to Social Work. And I need you to think about what are some of the values, what are some of the characteristics of a social worker? Whether you are working within direct practice or in an administrative area, we all have this idea that we need to be, or that we have a desire to be, a helping agent for people in need. So when you're thinking about being a helping agent, I don't want you to get overwhelmed with these two tracks of what am I going to do, what am I going to do? But think about exactly what you like to do, the work that you like to do, and how that would apply with the direction that you want to go in. When we're talking about some of the methods and some of the things that have changed, in your books on page 91, there's a chart here that goes over various roles that you may see in the field of social work, or that you may play as a social worker, a role you may hold. what I want you to understand is that whether you go through direct practice or an administrative position, these roles are not broken down to say that one is better than the other, but you're going to be functioning probably in multiple roles in whatever direction that you go in. So again, this is just some things to think about when we're talking about the profession of social work. Now, in conclusion, in chapter 3, again, I just want to go over a little bit of these political ideologies of when we're looking at the social work profession as a whole. Again, conservatives are saying, hey, people, this is all about you. Individual, family, this is your issue. You need to solve it. Liberals are saying, hey, you know what? We understand that life goes on outside of these four walls of the house you may live in. It goes on outside of the environment that you may live in. So we got to figure out what is your role versus what is the institutional role in working together to make you or to help you reach your goal. The radical perspective is we're looking for some significant change in this problem area. What is the problem area? It's whatever the client, consumer, patient may bring to you. All right, good people. This is chapter 3 in your text. I'm hoping that you were able to get a good understanding and you had an opportunity to review chapter 3. Again, a lot of the information in chapter 3 is a review from your introduction to social work class. But please make sure that you read this chapter thoroughly and prepare yourselves for the chapter quiz as well as the chapter assignments. All right, good people. Until the next time, love, peace, and bacon grease.